don't EQ the sub. You hear this all the time, and I think some people don't understand why they say this, but say it anyways. So I'm going to explain why you don't EQ the sub. And the truth is, there's nothing wrong with EQing a sub bass, as long as your sub bass isn't just a sine wave. So here's a sub bass, which is just a sine wave. And a sine wave has no overtones. Well, a real sine wave anyways. So if you EQ it, nothing's going to happen. All you're going to do is really change the volume. But a sine wave isn't the only way to make a sub bass. So if I switch it to a triangle, it sounds exactly the same if I have the EQ on. But if I bring it back, you got a little bit of overtones going on here. And if you want to control them, there's nothing wrong with doing a little bit of EQing. If I switch it back to being a sine wave, and I get rid of this EQ because I don't need to EQ a sine wave because it's not going to do anything. And I bring in some distortion, just like a tube distortion here. And I bring up the EQ again. Just move this up here. If you watch the spectrum analyzer on the EQ, if you add distortion, then once again you actually have a reason to use an EQ. So I can low pass here. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. And putting distortion on a sub bass is perfectly respectable. It's perfectly fine to do that. There's nothing wrong with putting distortion on your sub bass and then EQing it to control the distortion. People say, did you just EQ the sub as like a way of sounding smart? But if your sub bass is more than just a simple sine wave, then it's perfectly fine to EQ it. There's nothing wrong with EQing it if it's more than a sine wave. Like if you start with a saw wave on your sub bass, and bring in distortion, EQ can change the character. So, yeah. But I mean, it isn't necessary to EQ your sub, obviously. If I turn the distortion down, switch it back to being a sine wave, and then make it a much more controlled, simple sound. I'm gonna bring in wave candy just to so you can see the waveform here. It's a very simple waveform, and the more distortion you add, the more complex it is. And then you can tame it with EQ to make it more closer to a sine wave, because just one harmonic or no overtones. That would be a sine wave. And that's just how it works, I guess. That's how sound works. But usually for sub bass, you want to keep it relatively simple. So I guess don't EQ the sub is actually a perfectly reasonable thing to say, especially if you have a dedicated sine wave sub bass. With no overtones, that is just a sine wave, underneath a more complicated bass sound. For example, you've got this, you got a noise saw with, and with some distortion. And I'm going to Control L this guy, and I'm going to bring in a filter on this one. If you're doing something like that and having like a dedicated sub that is separate from your main bass, then that's fine. But if you're making like a dubstep drop, there's nothing wrong with distorting your sub bass and EQing it to control it so it's not as like awful to listen to. That's the video. Okay, bye-bye. I'm going to do a real video shortly.